Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Peter's Seaside ministry as seen in Acts chapter 9, verses 32 through 43. The book of Acts actually has Peter coming to the forefront all the way back in chapter 1. From chapter 1 through chapter 5, we've seen Peter as one of the key leaders in bringing Jewish converts into the church. He preached on the day of Pentecost. It was he and the Apostle John who healed a man as they were going into the temple. He was there speaking to the Jewish leaders, to the priests. We've seen him as a leader in the church. And then we came to chapter 6 as the first deacons were appointed. And we saw Stephen then becoming the focus in chapter 6 and chapter 7, where Stephen was put to death. Remember, with Saul assisting. And then in chapter 8, the scene moved to another one of those deacons, Philip, and his ministry first to the Samaritans and then to the Ethiopian eunuch. In chapter 9, we were reintroduced to Saul. Saul had been mentioned at the end of chapter 7 and early in chapter 8. But now in chapter 9, we saw Saul's conversion, his early ministry in Damascus. And now we come to the latter part of chapter 9, beginning verse 32. The camera is going to come back onto Peter. We'll see his travels and his ministry in the towns of Lydda and also Joppa. And just preview of coming things, that's the camera's going to stay on Peter. In chapters 10 and 11, we'll see him bringing Gentiles into the church. And then in chapter 12, we'll see his supernatural deliverance from execution. He's going to be arrested and condemned to death, and God is going to deliver him. Chapter 9 and verse 32, then, as Peter was traveling through all those regions. Remember, he had actually come up to Samaria during the ministry of Philip, as Philip had brought a number of Samaritans to know the Lord. Peter and John had gone up to Samaria in order to lay hands on them and that the Holy Spirit might come down. And so he's away from Jerusalem now. He's traveling through all those regions. And now he came down also to the saints who lived at Lydda. Now, we had seen Philip and Saul taking the gospel to those new locations. That's been over the last couple of chapters. But now Peter is going to be ministering in these places where there are already believers. Notice he comes down to the saints who lived at Lydda. That is, when we talk about the saints, that term can be used, I suppose, of Jewish people. But in the context of the book of Acts, it seems to be referring to believers maybe that had spread out from Jerusalem, had come to these other places because they had been persecuted in Jerusalem. And actually, this whole section is going to close referring to that note of persecution. And so he comes to Lydda where there are already Christians, and he is going to stay there. In verse 33, there he found a man named Aeneas. And if you know anything about the history of Rome, you're familiar with the name Aeneas. Remember, Aeneas was the name of the person who had been sort of the legendary founder of all of the Roman people, all of the Latin people. And so here's someone who has the same name. It's a good Roman name, but it does not sound like this individual is Roman. Notice he found a man named Aeneas who'd been bedridden 8 years before he was paralyzed, and we're going to see some parallels in that being paralyzed. I take it that this man probably is Jewish, but with a Roman name, and that shouldn't surprise us. We're going to see that a lot in the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts. We're going to see people that might be Jewish but have either a Greek or Roman name. So don't assume that they are Roman or Greek just because they have a name that is Roman or Greek. That's rather commonplace. And this Aeneas, he's paralyzed, and Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and make your bed. Immediately he got up. Now notice, Peter doesn't say, I'm going to heal you. He says, Jesus is the one that is healing you. He gives credit to the power behind the healing. And so sometimes we refer to this as a healing that Peter brings about, but Peter says, no, Jesus is the one that's healing. And that's a good reminder that the book of Acts is, we think of the Gospels as the ministry of of Jesus, the healing and preaching and teaching ministry of Jesus. The book of Acts is a continuation of that ministry. Jesus is still healing, even though he is not physically present. Verse 35, and all who lived at Lydda, and notice Sharon, is from the, Sharon is actually a Hebrew term from the verb yashar, to be smooth or straight, and probably gets its name because the coastline is very straight, and not only is the coastline straight, actually the land there is sort of flat. I live in Florida, and I sometimes refer to Florida as the flat place. Well, Sharon is sort of a flat place as well. So all who lived here at Lydda and the surrounding area of Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord. Now we have an interesting comparison. Remember that Luke is the author of Acts, but he's also the author of the Gospel of Luke. And back in chapter 5, verses 17 through 25, we'd had a story where Jesus had healed a paralytic. Here in Acts, we see it's still Jesus healing, although Peter's the one who is speaking the words. So it's Jesus healing a paralytic at the words of Jesus. In the Luke story, Jesus had said to him, I say to you, get up and pick up your stretcher and go home. We've just seen Peter speaking to this man. Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and make your bed. Notice in both cases a reference to that on which he had been lying. In Luke's case, immediately he got up before them. Here in the book of Acts, we read immediately he got up. Notice there's an immediacy to this taking place. In Luke's account, they were all struck with astonishment and began glorifying God. So it is also in this second healing. All who lived at Lydda and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord. So here are two miracles, both accomplished by Jesus, once while he was on earth, once as he's in heaven, and yet he's still healing long distance, and he's able to heal another paralytic. Now our story changes to verse 36. Now in Joppa, and Joppa is about, 8, 10 miles away from Lydda. Now in Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha. And Tabitha is it's an Aramaic name. It's very rare, actually. It's not very commonplace. It means gazelle. And so here's this woman. Her name means gazelle, which translated in Greek is called Dorcas. Dorcas is just the Greek word for a gazelle. So it has the same meaning whether it's in Aramaic, whether you say Tabitha or whether you say Dorcas. And this woman was abounding. Now, when I first saw that, I thought, gee, I wonder if it uses the term where she's like bounding around like a gazelle. No, it doesn't have that. That's just an interesting little coincidence where they translated it that way. Actually, I'd probably translate it, she was overflowing with deeds of kindness and charity, which she continually did. And I'm not saying she didn't bound around like a gazelle. She was active. She was abounding with all of these good deeds and love and caring for the poor and caring for. We're going to see some widows that come to mourn over her. I'm assuming that she had ministered to them in a very active way, but now she's not active. Verse 37, and it happened at that time that she fell sick and died. And when they had washed her body, and notice the washing of the body, what's taking place here, you see, in the Jewish culture, both back then and even today, they seek to have the burial as soon as is possible. And so notice they washed the body, they laid it in an upper room, and the idea is going to be buried very shortly. And so it happens, verse 38, since Lydda was near Joppa, and Peter's in Lydda, but the corpse is in in Joppa, the disciples, having heard that Peter was there, sent two men to him, imploring him, do not delay. In other words, you can't wait around, you can't wait till the next day. You need to, if things are going to be done, it needs to be done right now. She has just died. They have not buried her yet, but that will not take very long. So they're making preparations. They've washed the body. Don't wait. Don't delay in coming to us. Maybe something can be done. Verse 39. So Peter arose and went with them. When he arrived, they brought him into the upper room. That would sort of be the guest room. the upper room, and all the all the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing all the tunics and garments that Dorcas used to make while she was with them. Apparently, it sounds like she had been a ministry, had had a ministry either to them or maybe even with them. And who knows? Maybe this was sort of an early sort of a system where those who were widows and didn't have husbands to take care of, not only would they be cared for by the church, but also as they were able, they would care for others within the church. And Dorcas seems to have been one of those. But Peter sent them all out and knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, because she's dead, she's not there anymore, but he turns to the body, he said, Tabitha. And I like the way he uses her Aramaic name. That was probably her real name. Others might call her Dorcas, just like if my name's John. And that's the name I was given. If I go to a Spanish-speaking country, sometimes I will be called Juan. My mother actually was born in Puerto Rico, and so I have a whole Puerto Rican family. And once in a while, I might hear the name Juan, or I've been to Russian-speaking areas. I've been to Russia, and in some of those areas, my students have they've let me know the way you say that is Ivan. But here he calls her by her birth name, what I take to be Tabitha. Arise, and she opened her eyes. And when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up, and calling the saints, again, that seems to be referring to the believers, and the widows, he presented her alive. Now, there's an interesting correlation because Jesus, but not only Jesus, there's two miracles in one in First Kings and one in Second Kings where something very similar arises. So that you see the ministry of Jesus, and here is Peter that does the praying. Although, let me just say again, I think it's Jesus who does the raising. But Peter prays. In First Kings chapter 17, it's the story of Elijah, and in Second Kings chapter 4 it's Elisha, the servant of Elijah, because Elijah has now been caught up into heaven. And four times we're going to see a healing very similar. In Luke's account, it was the healing at Capernaum. Of course, Capernaum is there by the sea. Here is Joppa. Joppa is also by the sea. Um, in 1 Kings 17, it's a healing at Zarephath, and Zarephath is close to Sidon, which is by the sea. Unfortunately, we're going to break that sort of line because in Elisha's case, the healing will be at Shunem, which is not by the sea. That's at the east end of the valley of Jezreel. In Luke 9, we have the daughter of Jairus who dies. In Acts 9, here is Tabitha who dies. In the story of Elijah, it's a boy who dies, the son of a woman, and it's a boy who dies in the Shunem story with Elisha as well. In both Luke and Acts, we see the people that are weeping. In First Kings and Second Kings, it's the widow that's left, because there's a widow in each case, the woman who complains to the prophet. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus limits those who were present. He allows the parents, and he allows Peter and James and John, but everybody else, he puts them out. Here in Acts chapter 9, Peter sends them all out. In 1 Kings chapter 17, Elijah, we're not told that he's by himself, but he takes the boy to the upper room. That's sort of the implication, I think. And Elisha shuts the door as though to keep everyone else out as the healing is going to be performed. Now Luke's going to be not going to mention this because we don't read of Jesus praying. Jesus prayed often enough, but we don't read of that happening here. In Acts 9, Peter prays. In 1 Kings 17, Elijah prays. And of course, Elisha, each of them are praying. In Jesus' case, he's the one doing the healing. Although I would suggest that very oftentimes when Jesus would heal, sometimes he would pray first and then the healing would be done, because I think the power was coming from the Father through the Spirit to accomplish this miracle. Um, In Luke chapter 9, Jesus says, "Child, arise." In Acts chapter 9, Peter says, "Tabitha," that is her name, "arise." In First Kings and Second Kings, we're not told specifically of any words that are being said. In Luke chapter 9, at the end of the story, Jesus instructed them to tell no one what had happened. Why? Because he is carefully regulating the word until his death, burial, and resurrection have taken place. So that in Acts chapter 9, there's no such command. Peter, the healing takes place, and the child arises, or the woman arises, not a child. Tabitha arises, and it became known all over Joppa, and we're going to read that many believed. The the word is out, the muzzle is off. The word is going to go out, and in the case of 1 Kings chapter 17, just to finish up our correlation, where Elisha has performed a healing, the woman says, "Now I know that you are a man of God." And in the case of Elisha, in 2 Kings chapter 4, the woman goes in and she fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground. So in each case, the woman believes. And of course, the story continues to be told. We even have it in our scriptures so that we might believe as well. And so the story closes at verse 42. It became known all over Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. So has become one of a number of miracles that has produced faith, which is very often the result. In fact, I would suggest almost always when a miracle is performed, it is that faith might be produced either on the part of those who see the miracle or on our part who read of the miracle. And so we finish up with verse 43, and Peter stayed many days in Joppa. That's where the story is going to pick up. We're going to see Peter in Joppa in the next chapter, and that's going to be significant. We'll look at the significance when we get there. But here we notice he is with a tanner named Simon. Of course, we have two Simons. It's a very common name, Simon Peter and Simon the tanner. And the fact that he's a tanner is rather interesting because a tanner, that's somebody who works with leather, who works with animal skin. Um, because of that work, he's going to have a very distinctive aroma that surrounds him. In fact, we're going to read when we get to Acts chapter 10 that the house of Simon the tanner is by the sea. And so, very often, a tanner would have his place of dwelling on the city outskirts, where maybe might be sort of downwind, where it didn't smell up the whole city. Because when you're dealing with skins and animals that have died, that there's sort of a ceremonial issue with Jewish ceremonial cleanliness. Now that doesn't mean you can't go back and be clean. It doesn't disqualify you. You can always go back and take a washing, but it was a profession that was not considered quite socially wonderful. I'm not saying it was looked on with disdain. Well, I suppose it was by some people. It was a working profession, but it reminds me of what we're going to see in the next chapter, how Peter is staying in the home of a tanner, somebody that's sort of on the outskirts, and he is going to be sent by God to people that really are on the spiritual outskirts. He's going to be sent to speak to Gentiles. But we'll see that in the next chapter.